We are following breaking news out of the White House, where President Biden has signed an executive order laying out a range of punishments against Russia. NBC has confirmed the measures will include expelling Russian diplomats and imposing sanctions, consequences for election meddling, cyber warfare, and actions in Crimea. All of this comes just one day after the president made another big foreign policy announcement, officially announcing the U.S. will fully withdraw from Afghanistan by September 11th. Secretary of State Tony Blinken is in Afghanistan right now, where he met with the Afghan president about the relationship between our two countries and where it goes from here. NBC's chief White House correspondent, Chief Kristen Welker, is on top of all of this. Kristen, let's start with this Russia news. It shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, on the campaign trail, President Biden said, Putin, we're coming for you. And now he is.
Steph, you're absolutely right. That is the exact right framing for this. President Biden on the campaign trail as a candidate said Russia would pay a price for meddling in the 2020 election, something that Russia denies. Well, today we are seeing what that price is. More than 32 entities and individuals will be sanctioned, 10 Russian diplomats forced to leave the U.S. Also, punishments for hacking the SolarWinds hack, which of course targeted major U.S. companies as well as government entities. And they continue to look into those reports that Russia offered bounties for U.S. troops. Although notable, they are not linking the sanctions to that last piece of it. Steph, the president doing this in concert with allies in the region. He has been in contact with allies in the region. But I spoke with Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, just a short while ago, and asked him if President Biden conveyed to President Putin that this was coming when the two spoke. He indicated that, yes, that was a part of the discussion, that President Biden was quite frank with him that the United States would be taking some type of action in the wake of learning about the interference in the 2020 election. The bottom line, Steph, if you put this into broader context, what does this mean? This is yet another inflection point in this relationship between the U.S. and Russia, a critical relationship, but which is increasingly tense day by day, Steph.
As far as Afghanistan is concerned, the president says it was an easy decision, but critics, even some of Biden's own military, are worried about the threat that the Taliban could grow stronger again. What does President Biden say about that?
That's right. This decision to some extent overrules some of his own military advisors who were concerned that pulling troops out of Afghanistan would effectively leave a vacuum and allow terrorists to thrive once again in the region. But when President Biden spoke yesterday here from the White House, from the treaty room, the same exact room where former President George W. Bush announced he was starting the war in Afghanistan, he said he felt as though the mission had been completed, that the U.S. cannot be in a forever war. Steph.
Kristen, thank you. Let's bring in New Jersey Democratic Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, who served in the Middle East as a Navy helicopter pilot. She was also a Russia policy advisor and is currently a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congresswoman, when all of this news broke, there was no one we wanted to speak to more. Thank you for making yourself available. You know Russia. You know Vladimir Putin. Are these sanctions enough to stop him from trying to interfere in the next election, or do we need something stronger?
Well, Stephanie, thanks for having me. I think these sanctions are a good start to show Russia that there is a new administration in town, that we aren't going to stand by as they commit cyber hacks on our country, as they interfere in our elections, and try to divide our population. I think this is a good start, and it remains to be seen how Russia will react to this and if they will understand this as a need for them to kind of clean up their act and be better actors on the world scene.
But is Vladimir Putin ever going to clean up his act? Come on.
Vladimir Putin will likely be looking for different things. He's a former KGB guy. I think that is his mentality. It has been his mentality. He sees the United States and Russia as engaging in a zero-sum game. So any win by the United States is a loss to Russia in his worldview. So he will never be an ally of the United States. He's always someone that I think we have to watch carefully. I don't think he's very trustworthy. However, I think he understands he understands power politics, and he understands that if he continues these attacks on the U.S. under this administration, the response will be escalated.
Let's turn to the other news out of the White House. Do you agree with this decision to leave Afghanistan? And just as importantly, the way the president is going about it?
Stephanie, you mentioned two very important things. First of all, is it time to pull out of Afghanistan? And the answer is yes. We have really, been there for 20 years. It's hard to believe we're going to be celebrating or sadly talking about the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 this September. We have people who have fought in this war, and now their children are fighting in this war. It's an intergenerational war at this point, the longest war the United States has been engaged in. We have ended the ability of al-Qaeda to grow terrorism and commit terrorist acts from their base in Afghanistan, which was our mission. We have captured and killed Osama bin Laden, the head of that organization. Certainly, we need to keep up diplomacy, as the president wants to do. We need to commit to economic aid to ensure that more terrorist organizations and cells aren't being propagated from Afghanistan. But I think you see with the loss of life, that too many families spending Christmases without their fathers or mothers, too many families struggling through a loved one's PTSD. It is time now that we have, it is time now to pull our combat troops out of Afghanistan. But you mentioned a second thing that I think is really important. How do I feel about how President Biden has done this? This has been done in a way that I feel so much more confident in than under the last administration. President Biden himself said he maybe wouldn't have started this process like President Trump did, but he feels the United States has made a commitment, and he is honoring that commitment, something that President Trump again and again refused to do, honor the U.S. commitments in previous administrations, undermining our standing across the world, undermining our credibility across the world. President Biden understands the ramifications of that and is not going to do that. He also has done this in concert with our allies. After he announced this, our allies came forward and announced their own withdrawals. We aren't going it alone. We are making sure that the people who have fought shoulder to shoulder with us, the countries who the minute we were attacked on 9/11 were standing side by side with us to help us protect the homeland, we are good partners with them, that we are making sure that they have been brought into these discussions, and that they are standing again shoulder to shoulder with us as we make different decisions and withdraw the combat troops from Afghanistan.
Before I let you go, explain this bill Democrats are introducing today to expand the Supreme Court from 9 to 13 justices. Are you on board? And why do it now as opposed to waiting until after the president's study on the Supreme Court is finished?
Yes, Stephanie, I'm not on that bill. I don't think this is timely. We do need to have a study. I want to look at ways that we can ensure that in the future, the American people know that our Supreme Court is chosen, for example, in a more fair way. The way McConnell has done this over his tenure was, egregiously inappropriate and unfair. So I think we need to do this study. We need to look at ways of ensuring the public knows that our justices, those who decide the law, the highest court in the land, are chosen in a fair process. And so I think that's important, but we do need to look at all of the options. I don't think this bill right now is timely.
Congresswoman, thank you for joining us this morning. I appreciate it. Coming up.
As always, thanks for having me.
Away, the Chauvin trial set to resume this morning. No surprise, defense pushing hard on this argument that Floyd died from drugs and other health complications. What can you tell us?
Right, Stephanie, and they're getting some assistance from a key expert witness. Yesterday, it was Dr. David Fowler, the former chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland. And really what his purpose was to come up and cast doubt on the case that the prosecution has spent weeks laying out. So instead of saying that the death was a homicide, as we heard from the medical examiner and those other medical professionals, he said he would have ruled the death of George Floyd to be undetermined. Instead of saying that it was a gradual death that happened because of the restraints on George Floyd, he said that it was a sudden death that just happened during the restraints that were on George Floyd. I want you to listen to a sense of that testimony that we heard yesterday.
How did the heart and drugs contribute to the cause of death?
They were significant, or they contributed to Mr. Floyd having a sudden cardiac arrest, in my opinion. That's how I would read it.
Is it your opinion that Mr. Chauvin's knee in any way impacted the structures of Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, it did not.
Now, at one point, he suggested or speculated that carbon monoxide poisoning from the positioning of George Floyd near the tailpipe of that police car could have also contributed to his death. You heard a very aggressive cross-examination from the prosecution team where they got him to admit that he didn't even know for sure if the car was running, or that he didn't take into account the full weight of Derek Chauvin, both his body weight and the gear that he had on that day. So you saw that back and forth that played in the courtroom as the defense continued to bring witnesses that would create doubt in the case laid out by the prosecution. Steph?
Mary, was he successful in casting that doubt? I mean, Dr. David Fowler is the former ME from Maryland. He didn't see George Floyd's body. He doesn't know this case. We heard the opposite from the actual medical examiner who performed the autopsy.
I don't think he was effective at all. In fact, when he started talking about carbon monoxide poisoning, and they actually did spend a great deal of time on direct trying to say that there may have been carbon monoxide poisoning might have been a contributing factor. But on cross-examination, the defense was able to get him to, or excuse me, the state was able to get him to admit he didn't even know if the squad car was on. And he also admitted that there had been no testing on George Floyd to determine whether there was carbon monoxide poisoning. And the other thing is, if there was, it was the police officers who were holding George Floyd in that position. He also came across poorly because, unlike the other two medical examiners who testified in this case, he was giving opinions about cardiology, toxicology, pulmonology, and the other two medical examiners said they would defer to those experts. And when he was cross-examined by the state, he acknowledged he didn't have specialized expertise in any of those areas. So I think by the time the state was done cross-examining, he came across as a very poor witness.
Shaq, the defense could rest its case as soon as today. That would mean Derek Chauvin doesn't plan to testify. What do you know?
Well, that's the big question, whether or not Derek Chauvin takes the stand in defense of himself in his own trial. Of course, he has a right not to. He has the right not to take the stand and let the prosecution lay out their case. But if we see Derek Chauvin take the stand, it is very likely that it will happen today. We know and heard from the judge earlier this week that the defense will likely rest their case today or tomorrow, and then we'll hear those closing arguments begin on Monday. And then this will be in the hands of the jury. He warned the jury earlier this week to pack a bag when they come to court on Monday.
Mary, if you were his defense attorney, would you have Chauvin testify?
I would not. The case hasn't gone particularly well for them. I'm not sure what he could add. I should take a step back. It is his decision, but my advice would be not to testify. He would not do well on the stand, I think, for two reasons. One is that we've seen that the state can be very effective in cross-examining, and there's a lot to cross-examine him about. The other thing is we haven't seen any demeanor from him. It could be helpful if he got on the stand and he expressed some emotion or some remorse, but we haven't seen that from him at all. We haven't seen that from him in his reaction to other testimony. We didn't hear it in his voice when Mr. McMillan was challenging him right after this happened. He was calm and kind of cold. And so if he can't add that human element, that emotion, and he's going to get picked apart on cross-examination, I don't see the benefit of having him testify.
Mary, Shaq, Morgan, thank you. Now I'd like to bring in the mayor of St. Paul. Now to the latest on the coronavirus pandemic. Scientists from the FDA and CDC are investigating the issues that led to a pause in the emergency use of the J&J COVID vaccine, as doctors and federal officials try to reassure the public about the safety and efficacy of the other vaccines. I want to go straight to Tom Costello for the latest. Tom, what are you hearing about how long this vaccine is going to remain on pause?
So this outside CDC advisory panel that's now looking at the data on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine says it will take at least a week, maybe 10 days, before deciding whether to allow the vaccine to again continue operations, if you will, or dispersing it, or whether they need to put some sort of a warning on it, or even for that matter, cancel it altogether. That doesn't seem very likely. But it is important to note that we've now got a 7th woman who has developed rare blood clots after having the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So that's 7 cases out of 7 million doses, literally a 1 in a million case here. The CDC and the FDA stressing that this really has been very beneficial to millions of people, and the company suggesting that the benefits far outweigh the remote risks that we've seen with 7 people. That said, the CDC and the FDA wants to do a deeper dive on the data and get more answers if they can. This is all happening, Steph, as we have seen a surge in cases of coronavirus around the country. Up 25% in 13 states right now, up 62% in Michigan. A real concern there, with many hospitals reporting they are at capacity or approaching capacity already. And the CDC is also suggesting that part of the problem is that people have maybe let their guard down in Michigan. You've got younger people being exposed to the UK variant, which, as you and I have discussed, is a more serious and potentially more transmissible form of the virus. Steph?
Tom Costello, thank you. Joining us now, former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, also on the board of Pfizer. Scott, we have got to start with J&J vaccine being paused. Let's look at the numbers. You have a better chance of being hit by lightning than developing blood clots from this vaccine. How concerned are you that this pause could erode public confidence in vaccines in general?
Well, look, I think if the process isn't handled well, it can erode public confidence. What you need is a very clear path for how we're going to bring this vaccine back. I do think this vaccine comes back to the market, perhaps with some more language in the label about who it should be used for and what doctors should be looking for these remote side effects. What FDA needs right now is a very clear process for how they're going to do that. The pause wasn't actually a regulatory action. It was a recommendation from the FDA to the states that are administering the vaccine to suspend use of the vaccine. So they never really took a formal regulatory action. One option here is for the FDA to take a formal regulatory action, put the vaccine on hold for a short period of time while they review the data and bring it before the FDA advisory committee. That would give them a very clear endpoint for when this vaccine could formally come back to the market, perhaps with some additional language in the label on what doctors should be mindful for. So you want a very clear process and a clear endpoint for this process. I think the challenge is we don't really have that right now because ACIP really isn't a regulatory body. They're a very good group. They administer the childhood vaccination schedule. They make recommendations about pediatric vaccinations primarily. That's their usual job before COVID. But they're not the FDA's advisory committee that regularly reviews this kind of safety data.
Vaccine hesitancy remains political. It shouldn't be. It's a public health issue. But just yesterday, the AP has a new report out showing that red states are lagging in vaccinations behind blue states. We saw Ivanka Trump post a picture of herself on Instagram getting vaccinated, encouraging others to do the same. And what did the comments show? No, hell no, disappointed in you. Why would I want Bill Gates tracking me? How do you counter this type of vaccine resistance? It all stems from disinformation being poured to millions of Americans.
Look, it's going to be difficult, and that's why I think we're going to get to a point where supply is going to exceed demand. We'll probably get 150 or 160 million Americans vaccinated, but once we get beyond that point, I think it's going to become more difficult. I'm not saying we don't get beyond that, we will, but we're going to have to chip away at it. We're going to have to find different ways to administer the vaccine to distribute it, because people probably, once you hit 150 or 160 million Americans, they're not going to be lining up anymore. That's going to pretty much exhaust the really aggressive demand. And so, you're going to have to push it out through the big box stores, make it easier for people to get vaccinations, make it so people could just sort of walk up and get vaccine, push it out through doctors' offices so people can get it through people that they have a relationship with, intermediaries who they have a relationship with. That's how we're going to get the numbers up. I don't think that we ever get, anywhere near the whole population vaccinated. Maybe we'll peak out at 170 million adults, maybe a little bit more than that if we really chip away at it. That's probably enough from a public health standpoint. It's unfortunate some people are going to forego vaccination because we know these vaccines are effective. But I think you're right. There is a group of people in this country who are reluctant to get the vaccine, in some cases for their own personal considerations, in some cases for political considerations, and we're never going to pierce everyone.
Dr. Gottlieb, stay with me because I want to bring in Yasmin Vasugian. She is in Mississippi, a state where vaccine appointments are available and people aren't taking them. Yasmin, what's going on?
So I want to tell you, Steph, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, because we're actually at a vaccine center right now where they're having drive-through vaccinations happening as we speak. So, Finn, let's just whip around here a little bit because I want to show folks what I'm seeing. And I'm seeing a lineup of cars here. I mean, these folks this morning, Steph, they're lining up to get their first and second doses of the Moderna vaccine. They're not hesitant at all, right? They've been lining up for the last couple of hours. I spoke to a woman who was the first online. She had said she wanted the Johnson & Johnson. She wanted it to be one and done. But now that Johnson & Johnson has been put on pause, she's here for the Moderna vaccine because she really wants to get back to life. She's over 60 years old. She wants to see her family. She wants to travel. But you're right. I mean, this state, the state of Mississippi, 40% of the state are Black Americans, right? There's a high degree, Steph, of hesitancy in the Black community in this state specifically, also amongst white conservative men. Some of the reasons that we are hearing on the ground is, as you well know, because of this pandemic, they have been affected tremendously economically. Folks want to get back to work. They don't want to necessarily take the time off to come and get this vaccine. Another reason is this state is very rural. I mean, you see one house and then it'll take 10 miles to see yet another home. So they have to drive 25, 30 miles to come get this vaccine. And by the way, Steph, that costs a heck of a lot of money. That's another reason. And then there's this idea of a trust in government. They have a lack of a trust in government. But it's all about a ground game here. And Scott Gottlieb was talking about this. It's about relationships. It's about churches. It's about church leaders and folks that they know in the community telling them it's safe and it's okay. I talked to Pam Chapman. She is the head of Boss Lady Workforce. She has been employing folks, going house to house to try and talk to them about this vaccine. And she said when J&J was paused, it really hit them hard. Let's take a listen to her.
We were all excited because we had so many people committed to taking the J&J. And as soon as we informed them that they had taken it off the shelves, they panicked. Everybody left. They canceled their appointments. We had local industries that had committed to bringing their employees over to get vaccinated, and no one wanted it. That not that they just said, I don't want it. They just didn't want it. And they didn't want to take Moderna. They were out.
So, Steph, you got to understand, the J&J vaccine, it was the vaccine that so many folks want to hear. One, because of brand recognition. They know Johnson & Johnson is the baby shampoo, after all. And secondly, it's because it was a one-and-done thing. Because of the hesitancy in this community, they thought, okay, if I'm going to get one, I might as well just get the vaccine that has one shot. But nonetheless, it's all about a ground game, as I mentioned earlier. And they are pushing forward. They have right now enough supply of the Moderna vaccine to get to folks throughout the community. So they're hoping by putting billboards up, by putting flyers out and knocking on doors, they're going to get as many folks vaccinated as they can, despite the hesitancy, Steph, in the community.
Scott, before we go, for those who are going to not get this vaccine no matter what, can they get the rest of us sick? Every year I get the flu shot. It doesn't bother me if other people don't.
Well, look, the bottom line is everyone who is, or a lot of people who are worried about COVID either are or will be vaccinated. And a lot of people who aren't getting vaccinated are people who are never worried about COVID. Some of them already had COVID. So I think we don't need to get to 80% of the population vaccinated in order to get to something that approximates herd immunity, where this just stops transferring as readily. But we do need to get a little higher than we are right now. I think once we hit 50% of the population vaccinated, we'll be in better shape. Israel is about 56% of their population vaccinated, and they're seeing their demand fall off as well. So it's getting harder to vaccinate that incremental patient. I think we're going to see the same thing here. We'll get higher than we are now, but then we're going to see demand fall off, and then we're going to have to start pushing this out through non-traditional channels. Right now, we're dependent upon people lining up. There's going to be some people who will still get it, but they're just not willing to go out and line up and go online and make their appointment and go through the hoops right now. So we need to make it easier.
Dr. Scott Gottlieb, Yasmin Vasugian, thank you both so much. I am vaccinated, and I am psyched about it. Coming up, markets up 205, just 1 minute into trading as the day kicks off on Wall Street. And we've got breaking, very positive news on the jobs front. U.S. weekly jobless claims dropped to 576,000 last week. That is the lowest we have seen since the early days of the pandemic. At the same time, we saw a huge number on retail sales, up nearly 10% last month. Motor vehicle sales up 15%, clothing up 18%, electronics 10%. All of this with just 1/4 of the country vaccinated. This economy is getting stronger every day. Dom Chu, senior markets correspondent at CNBC, joins us now. Dom, combine these two numbers. We are well into a recovery, it sounds like.
I mean, it sure sounds like it. And a lot of economists and market experts have been saying that this was going to happen, that when you started to have mass vaccinations really as part of the overall landscape in America, with lockdowns, economic restrictions easing, there was going to be this pent-up demand for not just goods and services, but just for things like travel and leisure. By the way, you talked about all the strength in those key sectors out there. A huge part of this surge was a almost 13.5% gain in hospitality and leisure, bars and restaurants. People are aching to go back out there and enjoy some of the life that they had pre-pandemic. If you factor all of that stuff in, and you guys just had a segment on with regard to the vaccine trajectory right now in this country, if that continues on its current track, Stephanie, we are talking about possibly a huge move higher. But it's also, again, tempered by the fact that much of this was being attributed to the stimulus checks that just went out as part of the recently passed legislation to kind of give Americans a little bit more relief on this. So we'll see whether or not it happens again in the same way that it happened in May of last year when we saw this kind of a surge based upon those stimulus checks.
Sort of takes us back to that original idea of a V-shaped recovery. Yes, you can snap back once we're behind this pandemic. And every day, the more people that are vaccinated, the closer we get. Dom Chu, thanks so much. Always good to see you. Now let's